Okay, so thanks, and thanks, Monica, for the great introduction. So, um, I'm going to talk quite briefly about a project that we're working on with Monica and the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust. The site is 2224 Maynard Avenue, so it's in the right in the heart of Parkdale in Toronto. I won't read my land acknowledgement, as we've already acknowledged the land here that we're operating on this evening. So I think one of the most important messages for the evening is talking about the form of property ownership and how that really dictates everything. So what I talk about, what Graham talks about, your own experiences renting apartments, that all kind of boils down to ideas and strategies about land ownership. So what's a land trust? So where Monica works is the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust. So what is that? It's a not-for-profit charitable organization that owns and manages land in a community ownership model. And that's in direct contrast to what would be a conventional form of land ownership, which is particularly in neighborhoods like Parkdale, a real estate investment trust, or a REIT. And I'm sure you've all heard of REITs. And if you haven't, you'll start to notice that when you read the paper now. And that is essentially an extractive process where any value from the real estate investment on any site is then given to the investors for their sole benefit. None of it spills out to the community. So they're really polar opposites, or two sides of a coin. The PNLT is a not-for-profit land trust, as I said, and so they not only invest in the land, but in doing so, that investment manifests itself in ways that challenge ideas about how one develops land and what are the responsibilities of land ownership. So they will partner. There's the land trust, which owns the land, and then they partner with organizations that help support their community with housing management, building community, ensuring diversity of the communities that the community members that live in the housing, and also in the support of the culture. And so what does this achieve? Like, why become a land trust? In the case of PNLT, what they have done is they have increased accessibility, both from a physical perspective and from a financial perspective, for all residents in the Parkdale neighborhood. So that they expressly define their community as those living in Parkdale who require a broad range of housing types and financial assistance. They also generate more affordable housing by thinking strategically and innovatively about different methods of developing housing stock. So when you remove yourself from a kind of extractive model, which has a very sharp and narrow focus about what one does with the property, how do you extract the most value, leads you to a very small number of strategies in which you improve value in the land. To a land trust, you have a lot more freedom about the buildings that you purchase and how you develop them, and that becomes really interesting architecturally. And they also provide security of tenure, and that's really important. So all the renovictions that probably you've experienced, I've experienced, most of us have experienced, are not part of the equation with a land trust. And finally, they have a deep commitment to increasing the amenity of any building that they purchase and then develop for their community. So Maynard Avenue, you can see, is bookended by Jameson and Dowling, two larger streets in Parkdale. Our site is just north of King Street, so really in the heart of the Parkdale community. And in many ways, this is a story about a box. and what happens to that box over time and its reflection on a larger set of economic and financial pressures. So what's really interesting is it's custom built in 1977. In 1985, the same architect is hired to do renovations of the interior of the box. The box stays absolutely the same. And then in 2022, when after the PNLT purchased it, we were hired to work with them. And that's the first time that there are significant renovations, both to the box itself and to the interior in a way that isn't about just maximizing the amount of units. So I just want to go through the history of this building. Again, the history of the box, the history of the site. So what's really interesting is in 1977, this was purpose-built as a 7-unit apartment. There were 2 units per floor. There's, 3.5 floors. And the unit sizes, there were only 2 and 3 bedroom units, and they ranged between 1,260 square feet and 900 square feet. So that would be classified these days as upper middle class housing. I don't know if this was at the time, but this would have been pretty conventional housing in the mid 70s. So really interesting, in the middle of Parkdale, this was purpose built, private landlord. So not a REIT because there were multi investors, but still a real estate investor. So you can see the 2 units, the blue and the gold. And then in 85, building owner hired the same architect to do an interior renovation. And basically, though that floor went from 2 units per floor to 9 units per floor. So each apartment became a bachelor, identical, about 230 square feet each. And we were talking before the presentation this evening. It's really interesting, and I don't have an answer yet about what were the external pressures or influences in Parkdale at that time that made it more profitable to go from 2 units, 2 and 3 bedrooms, to 9 units of bachelor apartments. I think there's a really interesting story there, and it's part of the story of this kind of neutral box that becomes a reflection of bigger issues. And then, so 2022, we're working with Monica and her team at PNLT, and so we went from 36 units to 45 units, and that was achieved by adding a 4th floor. We kept the same number of units in the existing building, but on the 4th floor, we were able to add barrier-free units. None of the existing units were, so we already get a kind of bump from an accessible perspective. And again, it's not just people with mobility issues, but say parents with kids in strollers that need an elevator. There was no elevator in the building. It was a walk-up, 36-unit walk-up building. We added an elevator. We upgraded all of the existing apartments to make them function better as bachelor or single occupancies. We enhanced all the amenity spaces. There was nothing like a landscaped front area, no ramp to get into the building, no mail room, all the kind of basics that you would expect in an apartment building. It had been there in the existing building, it had all been there. But when it was renovated into bachelors, all of that had been removed to maximize the bachelors. So that's the rooftop unit. You can see it's just a mirror image of the floors below. This was as much a reflection about the constrained finances that PNLT has to do these projects. But again, it's also a reflection that this kind of unit can serve their public well. It's not, they're the community well. It doesn't serve all of them, but for some of them, this is totally fine. And then the other thing that we did, that because it's a land trust and there's an investment in long-term housing stock and long-term kind of amenity of your experience living there, is there was real design work to try and figure out how to make these units function really well, not only in terms of having a flexible unit, but also investing in the knowledge of things like, well, you don't want a bar fridge in a bachelor unit because then the resident has to buy really expensive sort of single serving meals. You want a full size fridge so they can buy bulk sizes and actually make something that's more affordable. There's a lot of we pay a lot of attention to the coordination so that everywhere you look in the apartment, there are miscellaneous bulkheads and all the things that you might see actually in a lot of condos. So there's a lot of work to make it really comfortable and pleasing. And then we worked out a really good barrier-free unit. Again, not things that would have happened in the sort of mid-renovation. And then a lot of work, the main work architecturally from a design perspective was in the front. So we had developed two options with PNLT, two ways to add on to the building to increase the accessibility, to increase the amenity, and to really augment the experience of walking along the street and entering your apartment building and making it respectful and enjoyable, which is really important. So a lot of it has to do with landscaping, has to do with adding a ramp, and not just a ramp that's the most utilitarian, but one that has generosity to it. And then we added, as I said, an elevator, a mail room, all the things that really make it work well. And then the line at the top floor is where you can see the rooftop addition. And then there is a separate idea about a kind of energy agenda. So we're going to hopefully be able to put in solar panels on the roof and be able to make it function better. We're of course going to change all the windows and insulate the building, so it will reduce the energy costs and operating costs and the operating carbon. So this was option A, and that was option B. In the end, we went with option A because it just adding that little bump at the front provided a significant increase in the utility of the building and the experience as a place where you could actually live longer term because it had a generosity to the entrance. You could actually have a place to put your strollers. You had a place for storage, all those kinds of things. So, oops. And that's the end of the presentation. It's brief and small, but I think the ideas are the big ideas. Thanks.
Thanks, Jana. And thanks everyone for having me. It's really, do you know how to do it? All right. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's great to see some, be with colleagues, see some familiar faces, see some faces I haven't seen in a while. So it's great. And also just the theme is perfect just in terms of the work that we do and the work that, the type of things that our practices together take on. The idea of care and the idea of maintenance is really a different ethos. I think it's interesting that we're now at a moment where ideas of care and maintenance and looking at what we have has become so topical and so important, where I think it's been quite a fringe issue, and in many ways sort of seen as a secondary issue as compared to, flashy new buildings. But more and more the expertise required to deal with our existing building stock is critical for all the reasons that we know. The climate crisis, the housing crisis, all the, compounding crises that we're all sort of tackling. And what I'm going to provide kind of a broader overview of some of the big sort of policy pieces that we're looking at, and then a few case study projects that, and looking forward to jumping into the Q&A. A lot of the work that my practice focuses on, and I know that Jana's practices focuses on, is really this era of housing. A lot of the work that I did as a student with Adrian and with others was really digging into where did this come from? Why is it that Southern Ontario has a remarkably robust legacy of this type of housing with big projects, big thinking, big planning, capital P planning, in a way that's just simply different than the way other comparable urban regions grew. If you look at San Francisco, Philadelphia, Dallas, Houston, Atlanta, you don't see this. This is a completely bespoke to the, in this case, the Toronto region, but really Southern Ontario and beyond. You see it cross country. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. That's a whole other lecture, but we can talk about it in the and the different parts to it. A lot of our practice has been sort of doing the bean counting to sort of understand this and say, how do we understand the place we live? Where are people housed? How are they housed? Who's housing them? And this is a map we put together for the province of Ontario about 12 years ago. And it was sort of the first time that there was really an accounting of all of these types of buildings, of these legacy towers. And we found 2,000 of them in the Greater Golden Horseshoe, which includes where we are today. And then beyond that, with some later work with StatsCan and others, just a huge supply of this type of housing. This is sort of high-rise housing across the country. And what we find that even with all the condo booms we've had, more people still live in the housing built in the 60s and 70s than live in all the condos we've built today. And just an extraordinary housing boom that happened. And as many people know, what we're dealing with is this legacy housing in many ways is at the end of its life. And so we were sort of at a crossroads of how do we reinvest in this housing? We certainly can't lose it. But if we don't have that standard of maintenance and standard of care, there will be disasters. This is the disaster that happened in the building on Parliament in Toronto and St. Jamestown, where because of an electrical fire, over 1,000 people became homeless overnight, and they weren't able to come back to their flats for 18 months. And that's one building that put so much pressure on the housing system that the mayor had to put people up in motels. And this was all over the news a few years ago. That was one building. What happens if 2 buildings go down? What happens if 10 buildings go down? We don't have the flex in our housing system to address it. So it's absolutely critical that we find solutions. The other thing we can't do is this for a whole bunch of reasons. Right now, a real sort of discourse around embodied carbon, but also the fact of embodied housing. You don't want to lose the housing that already exists. So from that, that's been a lot of my work over the last 15 years or so, and I've sort of built a really great coalition that includes a lot of people in this room to be able to say, how do we move this forward with all different sort of parties and partners through the Tower Renewal Partnership? And the broad set of ideas is let's keep what we have, let's value what we have, and then how do we optimize it through different forms of investment, the fabric of the buildings and the lands around it. Really looking at building maintenance for deep energy retrofits, but really for comfort and health, improving the social and economic life around the buildings, and then neighborhood transformations, with new housing and more housing where appropriate. This is just sort of a sampling of a lot of the kind of white papers and policy papers and things that we've had to do in the background to be able to sort of push things through when there's an opportunity, when the stars align on a sort of particular policy moment or a political moment, to be able to have the data and evidence to be able to push something through. One of the early wins about 8 years ago or so is we worked with the United Way and Toronto Public Health and a bunch of other groups really to liberalize land use in a lot of these tower neighborhoods, because not by design, but just sort of by practice, they were all single use zoned as residential, which means if people wanted to open up a small business or do really modest things that we all know make our neighborhoods grow, they weren't technically allowed to. And so landlords, being conservative and their lawyers telling them, what they would tell them, they were suppressing a lot of activity. So we were able to get consensus from the city to do a citywide rezoning and rezone about 500 sites. And the arguments we had to make is that in a new condo, the city mandated that you had this level of flexibility, but in older apartments, it was like technically non-conforming. So it was like there was just an asymmetry, and it was like in order to make that happen, it just took a lot of work, and getting it through committee, doing all the kind of political work. This was during the Rob Ford years, so it was an interesting time at City Hall. But what that allowed for was they're suddenly then working with NGOs, working with community groups like Food Share and others to be able to have all these sort of interesting things happen on these parcels. And this is some projects that we were directly involved in, working with youth to be able to reimagine parking lots, reimagine sort of underused areas. This is in Thorncliffe Park, where the Thorncliffe Women's Association worked to be able to do this amazing nighttime bazaars that a lot of you have probably been a part of. This is a group that we worked with, sort of designing modular furniture, so they were able to, do these, have this pop-up bazaar that they could then store, in their building. And then it began to expand and to take on sort of new forms. So this is a project where we were able to get a new daycare on a TCH site through using this new zoning, where we didn't have to go for site plan and didn't have to do a rezoning. So that was just sort of as of right, using it to be able to do something, which was really fabulous. We worked with SVN Architects as partners on that. This is one that we completed with our sort of chief landscape architect at the office that led this one. It was with Toronto Community Housing and a grant from Toronto Leaf Sports and Entertainment. And we designed this with the kids. And then when it opened up, the Raptors came and it was great and everyone had a wonderful time. But it was also just really thinking through, how do we take something that was a really underused sort of asset and then turn it into this multi-purpose, landscape. So really great to see these types of things, happening as these sort of aggregate pieces, and there's lots more to do. But the big hurdle to getting that going was to change policy, and that took several years of pushing a boulder up a hill. The next sort of piece of this is just physical building retrofit, just looking at these buildings are like cruise ships. They all have the same, they're usually made of the same stuff. They have the same equipment. They're all aging at different rates. And the projects that we've generally been involved in are the ones of having very distressed assets, buildings that are very much at the end of their life, have had very little maintenance, and it's a major job to sort of bring them back. And then in addition to that, not just maintenance, but how do we make them performative? And a lot of the work that let's say the market is doing is around the 10% GHG savings because of the stuff that people do, changing light bulbs, having efficient boilers and that type of thing. And, our ambition was, well, can we get here? Can we get to sort of near net zero or, around there? And what would that take? And then how does that also map onto the really important stuff? There's a real focus on energy. Energy is, crucial. I'm a big advocate of that, but I also know as a practitioner, you can make a low energy building that's terrible to live in. So you have to be able to make sure that it's actually comfort driven, tenant comfort, thermal comforts, adequate ventilation, life safety, community resilience, et cetera. And then, low energy is a corollary of it being performative. And to bring this all together, you need financing, you need standards, to what standard are we engaging in a retrofit? And you need a ready industry to be able to say, well, we can actually build this. We know how to do this. And so all of these three things are moving along, but it's one moves forward, the other one moves, it sort of catches up. And we're not at a point where it's totally singing, but we're much further than we were a decade ago. And I think that the standard part is really key. There's very little guidance on existing buildings. When you're dealing with an existing building, it's a lot of professional judgment in terms of what you're doing and to what level. What got this going was first provincial funding. This is before Doug Ford to be able to do provincial funding to invest in these buildings, which really primed the pump in the first generation of these deep retrofits. And then the National Housing Strategy, I'm a little disappointed with some of the aspects of it, but there really was a promise to say we're going to invest billions of dollars in retrofit, and some of that has led to some exemplar projects. And in fact, to the point where we're well past the pilot stage. These are all projects around the country, from Nova Scotia to Quebec to BC to Ontario, and there's an Alberta project here as well. So this literally is a coast-to-coast example of really ambitious housing retrofit projects that have been enabled largely through different forms of federal funding. And so we're past the pilot stage. There's a lot of learnings. We can really amp things up. And I feel like part of our job as an organization is to tell that story. A lot of people working on projects in isolation don't realize that they're actually really part of an ecosystem. So I'm just going to go through two sort of example projects. This is one that's under construction right now. It's called St. Hilda's. It's a 3-story private nonprofit. It's affordable housing, so it's a sort of run by a charity. When we got involved, the organization was in a really financially precarious state, and they were going to potentially have to sell to a private owner who was just going to make it market rent. So about 600 units would have been lost. So the city got involved, and then we got involved, and we were able to use sort of a bridge loan from the city to be able to create kind of a finance stack with CMHC and some other partners to be able to preserve this housing. And it's, I think, a huge win. This is seniors housing. It's very similar to the project that you were presenting with the modest units, because it's bachelors for vulnerable seniors, and thank goodness it has stayed in the system. These are some of the original drawings, very ambitious, kind of beautiful. This is from the early 70s, and it was a real campus and a real complex. And you can see the 3 towers at the base. There's a really interesting sort of campus of care, and there's medical facilities and nursing stations and other things. And sort of we went through the process. This is what it was like when we got involved. Some of the floors were completely empty, and the reason was just it became sort of a downward cycle, that as people left, the units were in such bad shape, they didn't have enough money to fix the units, so they stopped renting them, so the rent revenues went lower, and so on and so forth, until the building was almost empty. When I think there was about 30% occupancy when we were involved. And so we really looked at this with the anchor funding from CMHC to bring them up for accessibility, bring them up for for aging in place, and we needed a 30% energy reduction target. It was a electrically heated building, so that was actually quite difficult, but we were able to achieve it. This is it under construction, so it's well underway. The first tower is actually occupied to this level. We're doing a staged reoccupancy, where this is now the folks that were in the tower next door moved into here. This is finishing up and being leased, and then now we've started construction on the next tower. And then this is the campus. So there's this amazing campus, and there's this real ambition as a next stage to build a community hub, and to work with the city to actually make this, and a lot of the space that's not being used, a focal point of the Fairbank neighborhood, which has a real need for different forms of spaces. This is the new Fairbank station, which is kind of amazing. This used to be a gas station, now it's a plaza. And the next phase is, how does it become both a community hub and retail facing that station? And then this is the gang. This is the board who we meet with weekly. And that this gentleman here is really kind of his vision that kept this affordable, and to be able to bring these partners together. And next thing, what I'm showing is more kind of a project management thing, but like, this is what it takes to be able to take a project that's over 5 years and figure out this sort of rolling way that you're finding funding, getting approval, and making it happen. So these are the types of project plans we have to put together in terms of pre-design, the usual pieces that you do as an architect, but then tying it into the different funding streams, the different funder requirements. If you have 4 or 5 funders, you have to sort of meet those requirements through different reporting. They may be asynchronous, where there's a lot of work as a practitioner to bring this all together to be able to make a project like this happen. A lot of balls in the air. So that would be a phase 1, and then you have phase 2, and then they stack, and then if you bring in a phase 3, and you have to bring this all. So a lot of it is not just being an architect in the traditional way, but also how can you be someone who can organize a project like this and actually bring a project to a client who's to be able to bring that funding stream, or those other parties who could be a partner in it. And I would say that we're kind of in an amazing moment where there's such a focus on housing. There is funding out there, and in our experience, it really is the nonprofits, municipal or private nonprofits, who are the real leaders and innovators. The private sectors are laggards in this. They are not meeting the same energy targets. They are not doing this type of deep retrofit. It really is the nonprofit sector who's leading. And then this gets into the next project, which is the Ken Sobel Tower in Hamilton, which was about five years of the team full throttle on this, in a really similar way, where it wasn't just the design of the building, it was the design of all of the ways that we were able to make this project happen. It was built in 1967. It was a centennial project. And I think what's kind of amazing about it is it takes leadership, and it takes, I would sort of say, I would, you know, I wouldn't want to say it to the face of our clients, but it takes a certain amount of irrationality, because the people who are taking these projects on have such a vision and are taking risks, and they believe in this work, and it's highly risky because they're doing these new things, but you need that sort of level of risk taking to do something amazing. And so Tom Hunter was the CEO of City Housing Hamilton. He's now moved on to be the CEO of Toronto Seniors Housing. He's an amazing guy. His background is healthcare. So he came from a healthcare background, became CEO of a housing company, and he said, I've been part of building like hospitals. We build world-class hospitals in Canada. Why do we have absolutely appalling housing? And so his goal was to modernize Hamilton City Housing, that their entire stream of new builds, and they've got about 4 or 5 of them now underway, would all be passive house standard, because he was convinced that was the best standard to work with. And this project, which is their first retrofit project, would also meet passive house standard. So we were brought on to meet that challenge. That was a challenge we were very excited about. But at the same time, we kept on saying, you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be passive house. You can achieve these things, and you know, there are alternatives. And he was like, no, we're getting certified. We're doing the whole thing. And that was a fantastic challenge to dive into. So this is the project in 1967, Centennial Project. It was the tallest building in Hamilton at the time. It was this, you know, this idea of the public investing in housing. Similar story as the other one. It became dilapidated. By the time we got involved, it was empty. It was a focus of much political debate. And what is interesting, and what's so fantastic about Hamilton and their scrappiness, is it's sort of the opposite of what you hear about in Toronto, where there was a study done to say, does the city sell it? Do they tear it down? Do they, you know, how do they move forward? And the community, working through the local councillor, said, we have to keep this housing. Under no circumstances are you tearing this down. And it was the community saying, let's keep this as affordable housing. And so that was the mandate that the CEO got, and then we were thankfully able to be the ones to bring it to life. The mandate was 94% energy or GHG reductions, converting 20% of the units to fully barrier-free. And we modeled it on 2050 climate data to say, how do we keep this place comfortable when we're going to be much hotter and much more humid moving forward? We did some modest retooling of some of the common spaces. You know, we didn't do any additions. It was all just working within it, but with the idea of aging in place in mind. And when we first, this was not purpose-built as seniors housing, so that became its new life. Jen, I'm sure you're familiar with these, where you have to, you know, you have to go to your funder and prove how you're doing it. What's interesting is you have to, there's about 3 or 4 standards you need to meet that all are well beyond OBC. And so through this, it's just really great to say that it's not just about, you know, a wheelchair radius. It's about all these other issues of aging in place and general accessibility as you're doing it. Doing it in the confines of a concrete building is very difficult. So this was major surgery. So in the units that we made barrier free, it looked like this. What you can also see is it's, you know, fully new plumbing risers. This is new direct fresh air being brought into each unit. So this is a complete asset renewal, which you can only really do in an empty building. These are the little studios. These are all the compounding set of issues. Some of them are remarkable. When we took the drywall out to do some plumbing work, we found out that it was Swiss cheese between the fire barriers between units. So those all had to be fixed. And so this is what it looks like afterwards, a winter coat on the envelope, you know, passive house windows, new ventilation systems, new finishes, et cetera. And then this is the kind of twisting around where the kitchens and the washrooms were for the barrier-free suites, and to make that all happen. So this is what sort of the end result looks like. You know, very pleased with how this turned out. It's fully occupied now, and it's you know, going from a building that was providing 0 housing to a building that's providing 150 flats to people in need. The other piece about it, which is really interesting, was ventilation and some of these issues around health and comfort. So we insisted that the building be sprinklered. After the Grenfell tragedy, you know, that was just like, you have to have adequate fire suppression in these buildings. Thankfully, the client agreed. The other one was we really proposed like a best-in-class ventilation system. And the reason is all the evidence says that these buildings have really poor air quality because of migration of things going through the buildings. And thank goodness we did, because this was designed pre-COVID, but the construction was in the middle of COVID. This thing was under construction. And because of the ventilation strategy that we took for, direct fresh air into each unit, it was able to be occupied during the height of the pandemic, because it met all of the ASHRAE COVID standards, which didn't exist at the time. And then this is just some of the studies you get into when you're doing this. This is what it looked like, during construction. Putting the fancy windows, doing all the kind of air testing and all those things. And, and this is the final result. But the reason you get into all these technical pieces is it's really about how do you ensure that someone is comfortable at all exposures during all these peak weather events. And there's more and more of these peak weather events that we know we're going to be facing. And so we did one study, which was really interesting and eye-opening for me. The blue line here is a standard OBC building. The gold line or yellow or brown or whatever that is our study building. And this is exterior temperature. So imagine a really cold day in February, the power goes out. Most municipal codes say after 10 degrees Celsius, if it's still going down, you have to evacuate your residents. That would happen within 1 day of an OBC building. But with this building, it would take up to 4 or 5 days. So you can sort of shelter in place even if the power goes out because of the robustness of the envelope and that type of thing. So these are the things we need to start designing to. There's the other side of it about overheating and dealing with those issues. And then at the top, this was a laundry room. It had no windows except for this one little sort of porthole that had this fabulous views of the city and the harbor. So we moved the laundry room to the ground floor near a terrace and garden, and turned this into sort of a resident lounge for people to sort of look at the harbor. So that was a nice little moment that we were able to do, and some of the landscaping and that type of thing. And this is the final result. So, and then just to wrap up, we're working with U of T Civil Engineering on a 2-year longitudinal study to really do a whole series of tenant interviews, a whole series of social and a sort of both social science and civil engineering around performance to say, what did we learn? What worked? What didn't? How are we open source about this? Because this was a major federal investment. The goal of a project like this is to prove it's possible, and let's start scaling it. And what did we learn? So I will stop there and let's dive into conversation.